They say when you die, you forget everything. But what happens when you remember every single detail from your past life, including the moment you chose the wrong sister? This is the third time I've lived through this same lifetime, and each time I've made the same devastating mistake. Isabella stands at the altar in her pristine white dress, tears streaming down her face as 200 guests watch in stunned silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She thinks I'm abandoning her for another woman, but the truth is far more complicated. I'm abandoning her for the woman I should have chosen 90 years ago, her sister Sophia, who died in my arms in 1934, promising we'd find each other again. The morning of June 15th, 2024, I stood in the groom's suite at the Grand Willow Hotel, adjusting my cufflinks for what felt like the 100th time. But it wasn't nerves making my hand shake. It was the crushing weight of 90 years of memories flooding back the moment I turned 25 3 months ago. That's when it always happens. It's the exact age I died in my first life holding. Sophia Chen, as pneumonia took her away from me during the Great Depression. My best man Marcus knocked on the door, his cheerful voice cutting through my thoughts. "Ethan, you ready?" "Isabella looks absolutely stunning, man. You're the luckiest guy alive." If only he knew I'd lived this exact conversation twice before, in different decades, with different names, but always the same faces, always the same tragic ending. I walked to the window overlooking the gardens where guests were already gathering. There she was, Sophia, arranging flowers near the gazebo, where the ceremony would take place in 2 hours. 23 years old, just like she'd been when we first met in 1932. Her dark hair caught the morning sunlight as she worked, completely unaware that the man marrying her sister had loved her across 3 lifetimes. In this life, she was an art teacher at Riverside Community College, kind and gentle, just as she'd always been. The cruel irony was that she'd volunteered to help with my wedding to Isabella, believing she was supporting her sister's happiness. The first time I lived this life was in the 1920s. I was Thomas Mitchell then, struggling writer during the Depression, and Sophia was Sarah Chen, daughter of a wealthy merchant family. We fell in love despite her family's disapproval of my social status. When she became sick, her father refused to pay for proper medical treatment, claiming I was beneath their family. She died whispering that she'd find me again, that love like ours couldn't simply end. I was reborn in the 1960s as David Harrison, a young lawyer, and found her again as Susan Chen's, same soul, same face, different name. This time, she was the daughter of a prominent judge. History repeated itself with devastating precision. Her family arranged her engagement to a wealthy businessman while she and I conducted a secret romance. When she tried to break off the engagement to be with me, her fiancé's family destroyed my career and reputation. Desperate and heartbroken, she took her own life rather than marry a man she didn't love, dying in my arms once again with the same promise on her lips. Now in 2024, I was Ethan Miller, successful attorney, and she was Sophia Chen, younger sister to my bride-to-be, Isabella. The cosmic joke was that this time, I'd somehow gotten engaged to the wrong sister entirely. Isabella was everything Sophia wasn't: ambitious, materialistic, demanding. She'd pursued me relentlessly after we met at a charity gala, impressed by my law firm's success and my family's reputation. Somehow, in my confusion about why I felt so empty despite my professional achievements, I'd said yes to her proposal. She'd proposed to me, presenting a detailed plan for our future that read more like a business merger than a love story. But the moment I saw Sophia at our engagement party 8 months ago, every suppressed memory from my previous lives came rushing back. She was helping serve at the event her mother Victoria had organized, moving gracefully between guests with that same gentle smile I'd fallen in love with 90 years ago. When our eyes met across the crowded ballroom, I saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze, though she couldn't possibly understand what it meant. Over the months of wedding planning, I found myself creating opportunities to see Sophia. I'd arrive early to family dinners, hoping to catch a few minutes alone with her. I'd volunteer to help with wedding preparations, knowing she'd be there arranging flowers or coordinating with vendors. Each interaction was torture and salvation simultaneously. She was still the same soul I'd loved desperately into previous lifetimes. But she was promised to someone else, James Park, a fellow teacher who seemed genuinely devoted to her. The cruelest part was watching Isabella plan our wedding with military precision while Sophia quietly supported her sister's happiness. Isabella had transformed our ceremony into a social spectacle, inviting every influential family in Riverside. She'd chosen everything from the venue to the menu without consulting me, treating the entire event as her personal showcase. Meanwhile, Sophia would slip me knowing glances during family gatherings, as if she could sense my growing misery but couldn't understand its source. 3 weeks ago, everything changed. I was reviewing contracts late at my office when Sophia appeared at my door, soaked from the sudden thunderstorm that had caught her walking home from the college. I offered her my jacket and made coffee while we waited for the rain to subside. As we sat in my office's warm lamplight, she began talking about a recurring dream she'd been having since childhood, a dream about a man who loved her across different time periods, always losing her to circumstances beyond their control. My hands trembled as she described scenes I remembered living through. The small apartment where Thomas and Sarah had shared stolen moments. The garden where David and Susan had planned their escape. The hospital room where she died twice, whispering the same promise. When she finished, tears were streaming down both our faces. "Ethan," she whispered, "why does looking at you feel like coming home?" I wanted to tell her everything, to explain the impossible truth of our reincarnated love. But how could I destroy her faith in reality? Instead, I did something equally devastating. I kissed her. For a moment that lasted an eternity, we were Thomas and Sarah again, David and Susan, souls recognizing each other across the barriers of time and circumstance. When we broke apart, the guilt hit us both immediately. She fled into the storm, and I spent the rest of the night walking the empty streets of Riverside, knowing I'd just set in motion the same tragic pattern that had destroyed us twice before. The next morning, Sophia called off her relationship with James, though she wouldn't admit why. Isabella noticed her sister's sudden sadness, but attributed it to wedding stress. For my part, I began making preparations that I hoped would finally break the cycle that had trapped us for 90 years. Now standing in this hotel suite on my wedding morning, I knew today would be different. I'd spent weeks researching our family histories, discovering the supernatural truth behind our repeated lives. The Chen family had immigrated from a region in China known for spiritual beliefs about soul connections and karmic bonds. Victoria Chen's grandmother had been what locals called a memory keeper, someone who could bind souls across lifetimes to resolve unfinished business. The binding had been created in 1934 when Sophia first died, her grandmother desperate to ensure her beloved granddaughter would have another chance at love. But the spell had gone wrong, trapping us in an endless loop where outside forces always conspired to separate us. The only way to break it was for me to make a choice that prioritized our love over social expectations and family obligations. Today I would finally choose correctly. Today I would abandon my bride at the altar, not for another woman, but for the same woman I'd loved and lost twice before. Today I would trust that love transcends the boundaries of a single lifetime, and that some bonds are worth any sacrifice. To preserve, Marcus knocked again, this time more insistently. "Ethan, seriously, we need to get moving. The photographer wants to do some pre-ceremony shots." I straightened my tie one final time and opened the door. "Actually, Marcus, there's something I need to tell you about the ceremony today." His expression shifted from excitement to concern as he saw the determination in my eyes. "Something's about to change, and I need you to trust me when it happens." The next 2 hours would either free us from 90 years of tragic repetition or condemn us to repeat this cycle until the end of time. But for the first time in 3 lifetimes, I was ready to fight for the love that had survived death itself. The photographer's flash illuminated the opulent bridal suite as Isabella posed for what she believed would be the most important photos of her life. Through the connecting door, I could hear her directing the session with characteristic precision. every angle calculated for maximum impact on her social media platforms. She'd hired 3 different photographers to ensure comprehensive coverage of what she'd termed Riverside's wedding of the century. Marcus walked beside me, toward the chapel, his expression troubled after our conversation. "So you're telling me you've lived this exact scenario twice before, Ethan?" He paused, searching for diplomatic words. "That's either the most elaborate case of cold feet in history, or you've completely lost your mind." I couldn't blame him for his skepticism. In his reality, I was a successful attorney having a psychological breakdown on my wedding day. He had no context for understanding that the woman I was about to marry represented everything wrong with this repeated lifetime, while her sister embodied everything I'd spent 90 years trying to protect. "Remember when we were in law school?" I said, stopping outside the chapel's heavy oak doors. "And you asked me why I never seemed genuinely happy despite all my achievements? You said it was like I was searching for something I'd lost but couldn't remember what it was." Marcus nodded slowly. Throughout our friendship, he'd witnessed my inexplicable melancholy. The way I'd stare at old photographs with recognition I couldn't explain. How I'd sometimes call him by names that weren't his during moments of stress. "You've always been different, but I figured it was just your personality." It wasn't personality. It was grief that transcended lifetimes. I watched through the chapel windows as guests continued arriving. The Chen family occupied the front rows. Victoria Chen resplendent in burgundy silk, accepting congratulations as if she'd personally orchestrated this social triumph. Among the arriving guests, I spotted James Park, looking uncomfortable in his formal attire. Sophia had invited him despite their recent breakup, hoping to maintain appearances of normalcy. The irony wasn't lost on me that James was actually a decent man who genuinely cared for Sophia. In another timeline, one where I hadn't been cursed to remember previous lives, he might have made her happy. But cosmic forces had bound our souls together across decades, making it impossible for either of us to find peace with anyone else. "There's something else," I told Marcus, reaching into my jacket pocket. "I need you to deliver this after the ceremony begins." I handed him a sealed letter addressed to Victoria Chen. "Don't read it. Just make sure she gets it exactly 15 minutes after I'm supposed to say my vows." Marcus held the envelope like it contained explosives. "What's in here?" "It's the truth about her family's history. It's about why her grandmother performed a binding ritual in 1934 that trapped 2 souls in an endless cycle of separation and loss." I watched his face carefully, knowing how insane this sounded to rational ears. Victoria's grandmother was trying to help, but she didn't understand the consequences of meddling with karmic bonds. My previous lifetimes, I'd never possessed this knowledge. It's Thomas Mitchell in the 1920s. I'd died believing our separation was simply bad luck and social prejudice. As David Harrison in the 1960s, I'd attributed our tragedy to family interference and societal pressures. Only in this lifetime had I gained access to resources that allowed me to research the Chen family's spiritual background. The breakthrough had come 6 months ago when I'd hired a private investigator to research both our family histories, claiming I wanted to understand potential genetic health issues for our future children. What he'd uncovered was far more significant than medical records. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victoria's grandmother, Li Wei Chen, had been documented as a practitioner of traditional Chinese spiritual binding rituals. According to immigration records and community testimonies, she'd performed exactly one such ritual in 1934, the year Sophia first died in my arms. "Ethan," Marcus said carefully, "even if I believed everything you're telling me, which honestly I'm struggling with, what makes you think abandoning Isabella at the altar will solve anything? You'll destroy her reputation, humiliate both families, and probably lose your career in the process." Was absolutely right about the immediate consequences. Isabella would be devastated, not just personally, but professionally. Her entire identity was built around being perfect, successful, enviable. Being abandoned at her own wedding would shatter that carefully constructed image. The Chen family's social standing would suffer, and my law firm would likely ask me to resign rather than be associated with such a public scandal. Sometimes the right choice requires accepting terrible consequences, I said, remembering how Thomas Mitchell had made the opposite choice in 1932. allowing social pressure to prevent him from fighting harder for Sarah. That passive acceptance of others' expectations had condemned us to repeat this pattern twice more. The question isn't whether people will be hurt. The question is whether we'll finally be free to break a cycle that's caused decades of suffering. Through the chapel windows, I could see Sophia arranging the last of the altar flowers. She'd chosen white roses mixed with baby's breath, creating an arrangement that was both elegant and innocent. Everything about her remained unchanged across lifetimes: her artistic sensibility, her gentle nature, her unconscious grace. Even her way of tilting her head when concentrating was identical to Sarah's mannerisms in 1932. "There she is," Marcus said, following my gaze. "Sophia, the woman you're supposedly destined to be with across multiple lifetimes." His tone carried skepticism mixed with genuine curiosity. "I have to admit, you do act differently around her. More like yourself, I guess." That observation was more perceptive than Marcus realized. In Sophia's presence, I became the person I'd been before decades of loss and reincarnation had worn away my natural personality. With Isabella, I performed the role of successful attorney and dutiful fiancé. With Sophia, I simply existed as the man who'd loved her since 1932. "The binding ritual wasn't supposed to trap us," I explained, leaning against the chapel wall. Chen intended to ensure her granddaughter would find love in her next lifetime, but she made the binding too specific, too rigid. Instead of allowing natural reincarnation to take its course, she created a loop where we're reborn into the exact same family structures, same social obstacles, same tragic endings. The letter I'd given Marcus contained copies of documents I'd discovered in the basement archives of the Riverside Historical Society. Chen had kept detailed records of her spiritual practices, including the specific ritual she'd performed for her dying granddaughter. The binding required both souls to make a choice that prioritized love over social expectation. But it also required that choice to be made publicly, witnessed by the families whose interference had caused the original separation. "So your plan is to humiliate everyone in front of 200 guests?" Marcus asked. "That seems like a pretty extreme way to break a supernatural curse." "It's the only way," I said, watching as Father Thompson emerged from the vestry to begin his pre-ceremony preparations. The binding can only be broken by a public declaration that chooses love over family obligation. Made in the presence of both families and witnessed by a spiritual authority, a wedding ceremony provides all those elements. What I didn't tell Marcus was the most terrifying part of my plan. According to Chen's records, if the binding wasn't broken in this lifetime, it would become permanent. We'd be trapped forever in this cycle, reborn every 30 to 40 years to repeat the same tragedy for eternity. This was our final chance to choose correctly. The chapel bells began their preliminary chiming, signaling that guests should take their seats. Through the doorway, I could see ushers directing family members to their designated positions. Victoria Chen sat regally in the front row, radiating satisfaction at her daughter's advantageous marriage. Robert Miller, my father, checked his watch repeatedly, demonstrating his characteristic punctuality obsession. "There's something else you should know," I said to Marcus, pulling out my phone to show him a photograph I'd taken secretly 3 weeks ago. It showed Sophia at the moonlight, sketching in a notebook during her lunch break. But the sketch wasn't of anything in the cafe. It was a remarkably detailed drawing of a man who looked exactly like Thomas Mitchell, my 1920s incarnation. Marcus stared at the image, his skepticism finally beginning to crack. How could she draw someone she's never met? It's because part of her remembers, even if she doesn't understand why. I'd discovered that Sophia had been creating these sketches her entire life. Different men who all shared my essential features across various time periods. Her apartment was filled with artwork depicting scenes from the 1920s and 1960s eras she'd never lived through but somehow recalled in vivid detail. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, running his hand through his hair. "This is really happening, isn't it? All of this supernatural stuff you're talking about." Before I could answer, the chapel doors opened, and Claire Davidson, the wedding planner, appeared in a state of barely controlled panic. "Ethan, thank goodness. We need you and your groomsmen in position immediately." Isabella is ready to begin her procession, and we're already running 7 minutes behind schedule. I looked at Marcus one final time. 7 minutes from now, everything changes. Are you with me? He took a deep breath, pocketed the letter for Victoria Chen, and straightened his tie. I've been your best friend for 15 years, across what's apparently just one lifetime. I guess I can trust you for 7 more minutes. We entered the chapel to find 200 of Riverside's most prominent citizens seated in elegant anticipation. The organ began playing the processional as Isabella's bridesmaids started their measured walk down the aisle. Each step brought us closer to the moment when I would either break free from 90 years of supernatural bondage or condemn Sophia and myself to eternal repetition of this same heartbreak. Standing at the altar, I caught Sophia's eye as she took her place in the front row with the Chen family. For just an instant, I saw recognition flicker across her face, not of Ethan Miller, the man marrying her sister, but of Thomas and David, the souls who'd loved her across multiple lifetimes. In that moment, I knew she understood what was about to happen, even if she couldn't explain why. The organ's majestic notes filled every corner of St. Michael's Chapel as Isabella appeared at the entrance. A vision in ivory silk and imported French lace. Her dress had cost more than most people's annual salary. Custom designed by a celebrity fashion house and featured in 3 bridal magazines before the wedding even took place. She moved with calculated grace, each step timed to maximize the dramatic impact of her entrance. Behind her flowing veil, Isabella's smile radiated triumphant satisfaction. This moment represented the culmination of 8 months of meticulous planning, social maneuvering, and strategic positioning. She'd transformed our wedding into a networking event for Riverside's elite, ensuring that every influential family in Connecticut bore witness to her success in securing the town's most eligible bachelor. Father Thompson opened his ceremonial book, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of the occasion. He'd officiated weddings for 3 generations of prominent families, but even he seemed impressed by the grandeur Isabella had orchestrated. The chapel's stained glass windows cast rainbow patterns across the marble floors, creating an atmosphere of sacred beauty that made my impending actions feel even more sacrilegious. As Isabella reached the altar, she handed her bouquet to her maid of honor and turned to face me with eyes shining with possessive love. She genuinely believed she'd won the ultimate prize, secured the perfect life she'd always envisioned. In her mind, I was the ideal husband, successful, handsome, socially acceptable, and completely devoted to her happiness. She had no idea that the man standing before her was living his 3rd lifetime and had never truly belonged to her in any of them. "Dearly beloved," Father Thompson began, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent uniting couples before God and community. "We are gathered here today to witness the sacred union of Ethan Miller and Isabella Chen in holy matrimony." The traditional words felt like lead weights on my conscience, each syllable binding me more tightly to a future that would destroy both our souls. From my position at the altar, I could see the entire congregation arranged like pieces on a chessboard. Victoria Chen sat in the front row, wearing an expression of maternal pride mixed with social triumph. This marriage elevated her family's status while securing Isabella's financial future through my law firm's success. Beside her, Sophia sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, but I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers that betrayed her inner turmoil. James Park occupied a seat several rows back, his presence a painful reminder of the collateral damage my actions would cause. He'd loved Sophia genuinely, proposing to her just days before our thunderstorm encounter in my office. His confusion and hurt at her sudden rejection had been evident at every family gathering since, though he'd maintained his dignity throughout the ordeal. Robert Miller, my father, checked his Rolex with characteristic impatience. He'd built his law firm through decades of calculated decisions and strategic alliances, and my marriage to Isabella represented a merger that would expand his influence into real estate development. My abandonment of the ceremony would not only embarrass him publicly, but potentially damage business relationships he'd spent years cultivating. "Marriage is a sacred covenant," Father Thompson continued, "not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, discreetly, advisedly, and in the fear of God." His words carried particular weight given my supernatural circumstances. This wasn't simply a marriage ceremony, but a cosmic moment where 3 lifetimes of destiny would converge into a single choice. I glanced at my watch. 2 minutes had passed since we'd taken our positions. Marcus stood rigid beside me, the letter for Sophia Chen burning like a secret in his jacket pocket. His face showed the strain of supporting a plan he didn't fully understand but had chosen to trust based on 15 years of friendship. When this moment passed, our relationship would be forever changed, regardless of the outcome. Isabella's eyes never left my face, interpreting my obvious tension as nervous excitement. I'd always possessed an ability to see only what she wanted. To see a selective perception that had allowed her to ignore the growing distance between us over recent months. Even when I'd become increasingly withdrawn and distracted, she'd attributed it to pre-wedding stress rather than questioning whether I truly wanted to marry her. Into this holy estate, these 2 persons present come now to be joined, Father Thompson announced, raising his voice slightly to address the congregation. If any person can show just cause why they may not be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The traditional pause for objections stretched, longer than usual as Father Thompson's eyes swept the congregation. This was the moment when social convention demanded silence, when family obligation and public expectation created an unspoken pressure to proceed regardless of private doubts. In my previous lifetimes, this pause had passed without incident, sealing our tragic fate. But this time, I understood that the ritual itself provided the opportunity for breaking free. The Catholic ceremony wasn't simply a social gathering, but a spiritual event that invited divine intervention through human choice. Sophia Chen had known this when she crafted her binding ritual, requiring that the correct choice be made in a sacred setting before witnesses who represented both families. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 90 years pressing down on my shoulders. Every face in the congregation watched expectantly, assuming my slight hesitation indicated normal groom nervousness. Isabella squeezed my hand encouragingly, still believing this was her perfect day unfolding exactly as planned. Actually, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the chapel's acoustics, I have something to say. A ripple of surprise moved through the congregation. Father Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. Isabella's smile flickered momentarily before reasserting itself, though her grip on my hand tightened significantly. Ethan, she whispered through her smile, what are you doing? I turned to face the congregation, meeting Sophia Chen's startled gaze directly. Mrs. Chen, your grandmother, Li Wei, performed a ritual in 1934 that bound 2 souls together across multiple lifetimes. That ritual created a cycle of separation and loss that has repeated itself for 90 years, causing immeasurable suffering to everyone involved. Victoria's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain whether they were witnessing a nervous breakdown or some elaborate performance art. Marcus discreetly reached for the letter in his pocket, understanding that the moment for its delivery was rapidly approaching. Your grandmother meant well, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. She wanted to ensure her dying granddaughter would find love in her next lifetime. But the binding she created was too rigid, too specific. Instead of allowing natural spiritual progression, it trapped us in an endless loop where outside forces consistently prevent our union. Isabella's bouquet began shaking in her free hand as the implications of my words penetrated her consciousness. Stop this, she hissed under her breath. Oh, ruining everything. But I could see in her eyes that some part of her had always known this day would come, that my heart belonged elsewhere, despite my physical presence at her side. Sophia had risen slightly from her seat, one hand pressed to her heart as if experiencing sudden recognition, the sketches in her apartment, the dreams that had haunted her since childhood, the inexplicable sadness that colored her brightest moments. Everything was beginning to make sense, through a lens she'd never imagined possible. The binding can only be broken, I announced to the increasingly agitated congregation, by a public choice that prioritizes true love over social expectation, made in the presence of both families and witnessed by spiritual authority. This ceremony provides all those elements. Father Thompson closed his book with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the chapel like a gunshot. "Mr. Miller," he said carefully, "are you saying you wish to halt this ceremony?" "I'm saying I," replied, turning back to Isabella with genuine regret in my voice, "that I cannot marry you when my soul belongs to another woman." "I'm sorry, Isabella. You deserve someone who loves you completely, not someone who's been trapped by supernatural forces beyond his control." The chapel erupted into chaos as my words registered with the full assembly. Victoria Chen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against marble floors. Robert Miller's face cycled through confusion, anger, and professional mortification in rapid succession. Guests turned to their neighbors, seeking explanation for what they'd just witnessed. But through the rising din of shocked voices and rustling, formal wear, I heard the only sound that mattered: Sophia's sharp intake of breath as 90 years of suppressed memories began flooding back into her consciousness. The binding ritual hadn't just trapped us in repeated lifetimes. It had also suppressed her ability to remember our previous lives until the moment when breaking free became possible. Isabella's hand flew toward my face, but I caught her wrist, gently before the slap could connect. "I'm truly sorry," I said again, meaning it completely. "But this was never meant to be our story." Isabella's wedding dress rustled like autumn leaves as she stumbled backward, her carefully composed facade crumbling before 200 horrified witnesses. The woman who had planned every detail of the ceremony with military precision suddenly found herself starring in her own worst nightmare. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, the corset of her custom gown restricting her chest as panic set in.
"Oh,
"You're having a breakdown," she gasped, reaching for me with trembling hands. "Wedding stress, that's all this is. We can postpone. Get you help." "But you can't just—" Her voice cracked as the reality of public humiliation crashed over her like a cold wave. Every phone in the chapel was now recording her moment of devastation, capturing content that would circulate through Riverside's social circles for years to come. Marcus stepped forward, pulling the sealed letter from his pocket with the precision of a man following orders he didn't fully comprehend. "Mrs. Chen," he called out, his voice cutting through the rising chaos. "Ethan asked me to give you this." He walked deliberately down the aisle, his formal footsteps echoing against marble, as shocked guests created a pathway for him. Victoria Chen's hand shook as she accepted the envelope, her daughter's wedding dress a blur of ivory silk in her peripheral vision. The letter bore her grandmother's name written in my careful, scriptly way: Chen. 1934. Those simple words hit her like physical blows, confirming suspicions she'd harbored her entire life about her family's spiritual heritage. "No," Victoria whispered, but her fingers were already tearing open the envelope. Inside were photocopies of documents she'd only heard whispered about in family stories. Her grandmother's detailed records of the binding ritual, written in precise Chinese characters alongside English translations I'd commissioned from a linguistics professor at Yale University. Sophia had moved closer to the altar during the chaos, drawn by forces she couldn't name but finally understood. Her face showed the ethereal confusion of someone experiencing rapid memory recovery, decades of suppressed experiences flooding back in disorienting waves. She pressed both hands to her temples, her mouth moving soundlessly as she relived moments. "From 1932 and 1963, Sarah," I said softly, using her name from our first lifetime together. "Do you remember the apartment above the bakery where we used to meet? You'd bring me pages from your journal, stories you'd written about couples who found each other across impossible circumstances." Her eyes snapped to mine with sudden clarity. "Thomas," she breathed, the name emerging from lips that had whispered it in dreams for 23 years. "You wrote me poems on napkins because you couldn't afford proper paper? You said poetry should be written on temporary things because beautiful moments don't last forever." The congregation had divided into distinct factions during our exchange. Some guests sat frozen in their seats, uncertain whether they were witnessing a mental breakdown or something genuinely supernatural. Others had begun reaching for phones and purses, preparing to exit this social disaster before their own reputations became collateral damage. The wedding photographers continued documenting everything, professional instincts overriding personal discomfort. Father Thompson had retreated to the altar's edge, his ceremonial book clutched against his chest like armor. In 40 years of performing marriages, he'd never encountered anything approaching this level of disruption. His training provided no protocols for handling grooms who claimed to be living their third lifetime, or brides who appeared to be recovering memories from previous incarnations. Susan continued, turning to address Sophia by her 1960s name. You taught art classes at the community center on Saturday mornings. You'd save your lunch money all week to buy supplies for students whose families couldn't afford them. The day before you died, you made me promise that if we ever found each other again, I wouldn't let other people's expectations keep us apart. Tears streamed down Sophia's face as those final moments came rushing back, the desperation in David Harrison's eyes as she slipped away from him in 1963. The weight of family pressure that had driven her to choose death over a loveless marriage. The whispered promise that transcended mortality itself. Victoria Chen's face had turned ashen as she finished reading her grandmother's documents. The papers contained not just the details of the binding ritual, but also Li Wei's growing horror. As she realized what she'd done, additional pages documented her failed attempts to reverse the spell, and desperate prayers to ancestors asking forgiveness for trapping two souls in endless repetition of the same tragedy. Impossible, Victoria muttered, but her voice carried no conviction. She'd grown up hearing whispers about her grandmother's unusual abilities. Stories dismissed as immigrant superstition by younger generations who'd embraced American rationalism. The documents in her hands provided irrefutable evidence that those family legends were terrifyingly real. Isabella suddenly straightened, her panic transforming into cold fury as she processed what was happening around her. They're all playing an elaborate joke, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling situations through sheer force of personality. Some kind of psychological manipulation designed to humiliate me in front of everyone I know. She pointed an accusing finger at Sophia, who was still standing transfixed in the aisle. You put him up to this, didn't you? My own sister, jealous of my success, my happiness. Couldn't stand seeing me marry the man every woman in Riverside wanted. Isabella, no, Sophia said quietly, her voice carrying new strength as recovered memories settled into place. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't even understand what was happening until this moment. She looked around the chapel, seeing it now through the perspective of someone who'd experienced similar scenes across multiple lifetimes. But I remember everything now. Every conversation we never had, every choice that led to separation and death. Robert Miller had abandoned his seat and was now striding toward the altar with the determined expression of a man intent on salvaging his family's reputation through decisive action. Ethan, he commanded, using the tone that had intimidated. Junior associates for 3 decades, you will apologize to Isabella immediately. Complete this ceremony and seek professional help for whatever mental health crisis you're experiencing. Dad, I said, meeting his gaze without flinching. I know this destroys everything you've planned for the firm. It's for our family's social standing, for the merger with the Chen family's real estate empire. But some things matter more than business contracts and public appearances. The chapel's ornate chandelier caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, casting prismatic patterns across the scene of devastation. James Park had risen from his seat and was moving slowly toward Sophia, his face, showing the complex mixture of confusion and dawning understanding that comes with witnessing impossible events. Sophia, he said carefully, I don't pretend to understand what's happening here. But if you need someone to support you through this, whatever this is, I'm still here. His offer carried the dignity of a man who genuinely loved her, even if that love couldn't compete with connections that transcended individual lifetimes. Sophia turned to him with eyes full of compassion and regret. James, you're a good man, and you deserved better than someone whose heart belonged elsewhere without her even knowing why. I'm sorry I couldn't explain what I didn't understand myself. Victoria Chen suddenly stood, the documents from her grandmother still clutched in her hands. Everyone needs to leave, she announced, her voice cutting through the continuing chaos. This ceremony is over. Reception is canceled. We'll provide explanations later, but right now, everyone needs to go home. But Isabella wasn't finished. She grabbed the train of her wedding dress and swept toward me with the fury of a woman whose carefully constructed world was disintegrating in real time. You think you can just walk away from me? From our life together? From everything we've built? We built nothing together, I said, the words harsh but necessary. You built a fantasy around the idea of me, and I was too confused by my own feelings to recognize that I was participating in something that could never be real. She raised her hand to strike me again, but this time Sophia intercepted the blow, catching Isabella's wrist with surprising strength. "Enough," Sophia said firmly. "He's told you the truth. Hurting him won't change it." The sisters faced each other in the center of the chapel. Two women whose entire relationship was being redefined by supernatural forces they'd never imagined possible. Isabella's face showed the wild desperation of someone watching her perfect life collapse, while Sophia radiated the calm certainty of someone finally understanding her place in a cosmic pattern. "Choose," I said to Sophia, extending my hand toward her as guests continued their chaotic exodus around us. "Choose freely. This time with no family pressure, no social expectations, no fear of death or disgrace. Choose what your heart has always known was right." The chapel had grown quieter as most guests fled the uncomfortable scene, leaving only family members and close friends to witness the conclusion of 90 years of supernatural bondage. Victoria Chen stood frozen with her grandmother's documents. Isabella trembled with rage and humiliation. And Father Thompson watched with the fascination of a man witnessing either a miracle or a complete breakdown of social order. Sophia looked at my outstretched hand, then at her sister's devastated face, then back at me with eyes that held the wisdom of 3 lifetimes. "I choose love," she said simply, taking my hand as sacred in profane forces, finally aligned to break the cycle that had trapped us since 1934. The moment our hands touched, the chapel filled with an otherworldly luminescence that seemed to emanate from the stained glass windows themselves. The remaining guests gasped as warm light cascaded over the marble floors, and I felt the supernatural. Chains that had bound us for 90 years finally beginning to dissolve. Sophia's fingers intertwined with mine, and her face transformed with the radiance of someone finally free from an inexplicable lifetime of sadness. Isabella let out a sound somewhere between a scream and a sob, her wedding dress pooling around her as she sank to her knees. The woman who had orchestrated every detail of this ceremony now found herself witnessing the destruction of everything she'd believed about her life, her relationship, her very identity. "This isn't real," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction as the supernatural energy in the chapel made denial impossible. Victoria Chen dropped her grandmother's documents, papers scattering across the floor as she stared at the glowing couple before the altar. "Li Wei," she breathed, finally understanding the full weight of what her grandmother had done in 1934. "She really did trap you both." The realization brought not anger but profound relief, as if a family burden she'd carried unconsciously. Her entire life was finally being lifted. Father Thompson had backed against the altar, his eyes wide with wonder rather than fear. And for decades of ministry, he'd performed countless ceremonies, but never witnessed anything that felt genuinely miraculous. "The light," he murmured. "It's coming through glass that should be blocking the sun at this angle." The rational part of his mind sought logical explanations, but his spiritual training recognized divine intervention when he encountered it. Marcus approached us slowly, his expression showing the stunned acceptance of someone whose worldview had been permanently altered. "So this is really happening," he said, not asking, but confirming. 90 years of supernatural bondage actually being broken by a choice made at a wedding altar. He shook his head in amazement. "I'm never going to be able to explain this to anyone." The luminescence began to fade as the binding completed its dissolution, leaving behind a profound sense of peace that seemed to settle over everyone remaining in the chapel. Sophia and I stood together, no longer Thomas and Sarah, David and Susan, but finally ourselves, Ethan and Sophia.
Free to love.
Without cosmic interference for the first time in 3 lifetimes. "It's over," Sophia said softly, her voice filled with wonder. "The dreams that never made sense, the feeling of searching for something I couldn't name, the sadness that had no source. it's all finally over. She looked at Isabella, still kneeling. In her ruined wedding dress, in her expression filled with genuine compassion. I never wanted to hurt you. In any lifetime, causing you pain was never part of what I hoped for. Isabella struggled to her feet, supported by her mother, who had moved to help her daughter salvage whatever dignity remained from this impossible situation. I loved him, Isabella said, her voice broken but no longer angry. I really thought I could make him happy, make us both happy. But you're right, I built a fantasy around someone whose heart was never available to be one. Sophia Chen gathered her grandmother's scattered documents, handling them now with reverence rather than shock. These need to be properly preserved, she said, her voice thoughtful. Other families might be dealing with similar supernatural inheritance without understanding what they're facing. Leeway meant well, but her actions created consequences she never anticipated. Robert Miller stood near the chapel's exit, his face cycling through professional mortification and paternal concern. The business implications of this day would be severe, the law firm's reputation damaged, the merger with the Chen families, real estate empire destroyed, social relationships strained beyond repair. But looking at his son's transformed expression, he found himself wondering if some costs were worth paying. Ethan, he said finally, I don't understand what happened here today, but I've never seen you look genuinely happy before this moment. Maybe that matters more than contracts and social standing. His admission carried the weight of a man reassessing decades of priorities in light of witnessing the impossible. James Park approached our small group, his dignity intact despite the chaos surrounding us. Sophia, he said quietly, I want you to know that I don't regret loving you, even knowing now that your heart belonged elsewhere across multiple lifetimes. You taught me what genuine love looks like, and that's a gift I'll carry forward. His gracious words brought tears to Sophia's eyes. You deserved someone who could love you completely, she replied. I hope you find her, and when you do, she'll be the luckiest woman alive. The chapel had grown quiet except for the soft sounds of Isabella's controlled weeping and the rustle of formal clothes as the last witnesses prepared to leave. Father Thompson closed his ceremonial book with finality, understanding that what he'd witnessed transcended any traditional religious ceremony he might have performed. I don't know what authority I have to pronounce anything about supernatural bonds being broken, he said with a slight smile. But if two souls have found each other across 90 years of separation, perhaps that's blessing enough. Victoria. Chen helped Isabella toward the chapel's exit, pausing to address us one final time. My grandmother spent the last 20 years of her life trying to undo what she'd done, she said. I think she'd be at peace knowing the binding is finally broken, even if the cost was considerable for everyone involved. As the chapel emptied around us, Sophia and I stood together in the fading afternoon light. Hands still intertwined, finally free to begin the life we'd been denied across 3 different incarnations. The weight of decades lifted from our shoulders, replaced by the simple joy of being present in a moment that belonged entirely to us. So what happens now? Sophia asked, her smile radiant with possibilities we'd never been allowed to explore. Now, I said, bringing her hand to my lips, we get to find out what love looks like when it's not fighting against cosmic forces. We get to be ordinary people living an extraordinary love story that finally gets to have a happy ending. Outside the chapel, Riverside continued its normal Saturday afternoon rhythm, unaware that 90 years of supernatural tragedy had just been resolved within the walls of St. Michael's. But for two souls who had loved each other across impossible circumstances, the ordinary world had never looked more beautiful or full of promise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.